Picture this: two cavemen. No biology textbooks, no sex ed class, no older sibling to awkwardly explain things behind the woolly mammoth pen. Just two humans staring at each other, somehow needing to figure out how to keep the entire species from going extinct. No pressure, right? And yet, it worked. Every single one of your ancestors, every last one, going back hundreds of thousands of years, figured it out. No manual, no teacher, no Google. So today we're asking the question nobody thinks to ask until it's way too late at a dinner party. How did our ancestors actually know how to reproduce? Because the answer isn't they were smart. The answer is way weirder, way older, and honestly a little bit uncomfortable. Let's dig in. Here's the first twist. Nobody invented reproduction. Nobody sat around a fire and brainstormed it. The instinct to mate didn't start with humans. It's about as old as sexual reproduction itself, which stretches back over 1 billion years, long before there were brains capable of figuring anything out at all. Think about it this way. A spider doesn't attend spider school. A salmon doesn't get a pep talk before swimming upstream. Somewhere in their genetic code is a set of instructions that basically says, when you feel this, do that. No thinking required. No understanding required. Just an ancient hardwired script running quietly in the background of every living thing. Humans inherited that same script. Long before our ancestors had language, long before they had fire, long before they had the first flicker of self-awareness, their bodies already knew what to do. Puberty didn't wait for permission. Hormones didn't ask if you'd read the instructions first. The drive showed up on its own. The same way hunger shows up, the same way thirst shows up, uninvited, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. So the honest answer to how did they know starts here. They didn't need to know. They just needed to feel. But feeling alone doesn't explain everything. Evolution had a problem to solve, and it solved it in the sneakiest way possible. Reproduction is expensive. It takes energy, time, and risk. If it felt neutral, or worse, unpleasant, a lot of creatures simply wouldn't bother. So evolution built in an incentive so powerful that organisms would pursue it again and again without ever understanding why. That incentive is pleasure. Every species that reproduces sexually experiences some version of this built-in reward system. It's the same trick your brain uses to make you eat when you're starving or drink when you're dehydrated. Except this reward isn't tied to individual survival. It's tied to the survival of the entire species, running quietly for generations, disguised as something that simply feels good. Our ancestors didn't need a diagram. They didn't need to understand fertilization or eggs or any of the biology happening beneath the surface. All they needed was a body that rewarded the behavior evolution needed them to repeat, and a body that, frankly, made it very hard to ignore that reward. That's not a coincidence. That's the entire design. Now here's where it gets interesting, because instinct alone doesn't explain the details. Instinct tells you that something should happen. It doesn't hand you a step-by-step guide. So where did the details come from? The same place almost everything else came from in early human life. Watching. Early humans lived in tight-knit groups. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. People slept close together, worked close together, and lived their entire lives within eyesight of each other. In that kind of environment, very little stayed hidden for long, including intimacy between adults. Children raised in these groups grew up surrounded by animals mating, adults pairing off, and the general rhythms of life and birth playing out constantly around them. There was no concept of the talk because there didn't need to be one. Observation did the teaching. By the time a young person's own instincts kicked in during puberty, they weren't starting from zero. They'd already spent years absorbing the basic shape of what was supposed to happen, the same way children today absorb language just by being surrounded by people speaking it. This is actually a strategy still used across the animal kingdom. Many primates, our closest living relatives, learn mating behavior partly through observation, especially in social species where young animals stay close to adults for years. Some primates raised in isolation without ever observing others actually struggle to mate successfully as adults. That single fact is one of the strongest clues we have. It tells us that instinct provides the drive, but social learning fills in a surprising number of the details. Our ancestors weren't figuring this out in a vacuum. They were born into a world already saturated with the answer. whether anyone ever said a single word about it. There's another layer to this that's easy to overlook. The human body itself is not subtle. Evolution didn't just install a drive and call it a day. It built physical signals into the human body that practically hand-deliver the instructions. Anatomy fits together in a way that's, frankly, hard to misinterpret. Arousal produces obvious physical changes. Attraction comes with its own set of unmistakable signals, changes in scent, behavior, posture, attention. None of this required cultural transmission. None of it required someone explaining anything out loud. The body itself acts as its own instructor, nudging behavior in the right direction through sensation rather than instruction. This is actually common throughout nature. Countless species with zero capacity for abstract thought manage to reproduce successfully every single generation, purely because their bodies are built to respond to specific stimuli in specific ways. Humans are more complex than most of these species, sure, but the underlying mechanism isn't fundamentally different. Our ancestors' bodies were quietly doing a huge share of the teaching that we now assume requires a classroom. Now, here's where things take a genuinely fascinating turn, because knowing how to have sex and understanding why it results in a baby are two completely different kinds of knowledge. Anthropologists have found evidence that in some hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies, the direct biological link between sex and pregnancy wasn't always fully understood in the way we understand it today. Some cultures, studied by researchers in more recent centuries, held beliefs that pregnancy came from spirits entering a woman's body, or from repeated acts over time gradually building a child, rather than a single, direct cause and effect event. That might sound bizarre from a modern standpoint, but it actually makes a strange kind of sense. Pregnancy doesn't happen immediately. There's a delay of weeks before any physical sign appears, and back then, there was no way to trace that delay back to a specific moment with any real precision. Without that traceability, cause and effect can get blurry, especially across a species that, for most of its history, had no written language to record patterns over time. So here's the twist within the twist. Our ancestors may have known exactly how to reproduce, mechanically speaking, long before they fully understood why it worked. The behavior came first, driven by instinct and pleasure and observation. The biological understanding came much later, arguably in a truly scientific sense only within the last few centuries. In other words, humanity was extremely good at doing this long before humanity understood what it was actually doing, which honestly tracks with a lot of human history. Once early human societies became more complex, once language developed, once communities grew larger and more structured, something new appeared: intentional teaching. Many ancient and indigenous cultures developed formal rites of passage tied to puberty. These weren't biology lessons in the modern sense. They were ceremonies, initiations, and structured transitions into adulthood, often separating boys and girls into distinct groups where older members of the community would pass down not just practical knowledge, but social expectations, who you could pair with, what responsibilities came with it, and how it connected to the survival of the group as a whole. This is a crucial shift. Early humans didn't just rely on raw instinct forever. As societies grew more organized, they layered culture on top of biology. Reproduction stopped being just a private instinctual act and became something wrapped in social rules, community expectations, and shared responsibility for raising children. This is also, in a way, the birth of sex education itself, just not in the form we'd recognize today. It wasn't written down, it wasn't standardized, but it existed, passed from elder to younger, generation after generation, blending survival instinct with cultural wisdom. So why does any of this matter now, tens of thousands of years later? Because it reframes something we tend to take for granted. We live in a world with textbooks, diagrams, and search engines that can answer almost any question in seconds. It's easy to assume that knowledge like this always required deliberate teaching, that without a class, without a book, without an explicit conversation, nobody would ever figure it out. But our ancestors prove otherwise. They show us that some of the most fundamental aspects of human survival were never really taught in the way we think of teaching today. They were inherited, written directly into instinct, reinforced by pleasure, filled in through observation, and only much later wrapped in ritual and shared understanding. It's a reminder that human beings are not blank slates arriving into the world needing complete instructions for everything. We're the product of an unbroken chain of successful reproduction stretching back further than we can really comprehend, and every single link in that chain figured it out. Not because they were told, because it was already built in. So how did our ancestors know how to reproduce? Not from a lecture, not from a diagram scratched into a cave wall. They knew because evolution left them very little choice, wiring the drive directly into the body, rewarding the behavior with pleasure powerful enough to guarantee repetition, and surrounding every child with enough real-world observation to fill in the rest. The biological understanding, the actual science of why it worked, came thousands of generations later. But the behavior itself? That was never really a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a survival mechanism that had already been running, quietly and successfully, since long before the first human ever asked a question about anything at all. And somehow, that unbroken chain, running instinct after instinct, generation after generation, eventually led all the way to you, sitting here, curious enough to ask the question in the first place. If this blew your mind a little, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started uncovering the strange, surprising truths hiding behind the most obvious parts of being human.